Hello everyone, my name's David Scott, book lover extraordinaire. Today we're talking about Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you're looking for essays, suggestions, and ideas, head over to study.com. I'll leave a link in the description. So when we're thinking about form versus content, we're thinking about the structure of the novel, how it's written. This is a novella, actually, because it's smaller than a novel. When we think of form versus content, or form and content, we're thinking about the relationship that they have. Form is how the novel is structured. Content is what the novel is about, or the story is about. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this book is just, it is always stuck in my mind as one of the oddest forms that I have ever encountered. So what's going on with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that 2/3 of the book is written in the third person omniscient, which means we get the third person perspective of more than one character. It's not just following one character through the book. Then the last 1/3 of the book is in the epistolary form. And what's interesting, if you want to get theoretical or symbolic, or just you want to go down that scholarly road, you can kind of like flesh out the idea that the epistolary section of this book is actually an extraction of the very last chapter, where Mr. Utterson is in the process of trying to figure out what's going on. He's got 3 letters, and so we are given those letters. One is Lanyon's narrative, the other is Jekyll's narrative, and then the other is a will, I think. We don't read the will, we know what the will consists of. So when we think of form and content, or form versus content, and we want to look at relationships, then so the form is where and for this book is where the last third of the book is extracted from. It's an extraction of the last little section of the main narrative. But then if we look at the content, Mr. Hyde is an extraction of Dr. Jekyll. And so we have that unification of form and content. So that really just kind of is amazing to me, because it just, you don't know if it was done intentionally to do that, but it's one of those things that nature provides for us that's really kind of fun to look at and explore. The troglodyte. What do we say about this image other than it's the image of how modern man thinks about his deep past? So we have the troglodyte, and it's derogatory when you use that word. So it would seem we know a lot more about our past than we used to. We know that cultures started, deep, much deeper than we had originally thought. And we also know that cavemen maybe they lived in caves, but the notion of caveman isn't, as dense and stupid as we project, as it used to be projected. So I think it's interesting. What it comes from is, for the most part, in a book like this, and maybe there's some other books out there if you want to leave a comment about it. There is a movie I'm going to mention that does this too. But what we have is Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, and we have The Descent of Man in 1871, also by Darwin. And these are ideas that just rocked the community at the time. And then shortly after, you have Robert Louis Stevenson writing about mankind's more primitive side being troglodytic. He mentions the word ape-like 3 times. He uses the word monkey once, and then there's also a mention of Hyde being dwarfish, which is something that I wrote about in a blog post. I'll leave a link to that in the description, about Victorian ideas on dwarfism. The troglodyte, which is Hyde, is known as a deformity, which it shouldn't really, in this day and age, it's the natural process of how we became who we are, and that's how we look on our ancestors with beauty now and affection and love. But back, in this day and age, it was really kind of, there was an offensive, and there probably still is. It's a science versus religion type idea here, and so Hyde is, our deeper inner selves from the past, from the deep past, is primitive, and Louis Stevenson goes even as far to say that it's Satan's signature. He's pure evil. So these are ideas that have been shaped since, but this is, how we view the primitive sides of our human selves 100 years ago, and potentially even to this day. There is another story or movie called Altered States where the same idea is brought up again. He has this contraption where he is able to tap into the primitive side, and sure enough, the main character is, he draws out this primitive side, and it's basically apish. They make the ape not benevolent. They make him crazy and nuts, and he's running around, he's climbing trees. That is a stereotype, really, that was created, and it's not something that's always necessarily grounded in science. The other thing I wanted to mention on that note is that when we see murders in movies, or maybe read about them, it seems kind of interesting that Hyde's murders, I would characterize them as crude, because Hyde tramples a little girl. He doesn't kill her, but it's crude. To trample someone. And then he, Mr. Danvers is clubbed to death. So this isn't like a clean, there's nothing clean about killing, obviously, but it's, if you shoot someone, that's how we think of murder, or we think of stabbing. And these are all crude too. I'm not going to deny that, but there's something kind of extra crude about clubbing someone or trampling them. It's just, that is an addition to the primitive nature that is being described here. Mr. Utterson is the Victorian man's man. He is just upright, clean, upstanding, and he is the voice of reason in this story. He has a degree in law. He's just excessively educated, and what I'm noticing is that there's this tendency when these fantastical stories are written, as in Dracula 2, Stoker takes it to an extensive extent that he has Van Helsing taking this enormous amount of time to convince his peers that something supernatural is going on, and keeps having to sort of beat around the bush to try to explain that there's a vampire going on. And so when Poole is trying to tell Utterson towards the end of the story that something is not right, and he's describing all these things that are to Poole, he's venturing into the fantastic, the supernatural potentially, and Utterson isn't having it. He's like, there's a rational explanation. There's a rational explanation. There's a rational explanation to everything. The interesting thing that Stevenson did with the book is we never know what Utterson's reaction is to the letters, because we know that Utterson never actually saw the transformation occur from Jekyll to Hyde or vice versa. Lanyon did, and it killed him, which is another subject. I'm not altogether certain that seeing something like that would cause death. I think that's a little over the top, and I think that kind of falls in line with the idea of all this fainting by women that you hear of throughout the Victorian age. That's another subject. At any rate, there's the Victorian skepticism is really one that the scientific community brought to the sphere of human interaction in England and around the continent and the world for that matter, which everything that is supernatural isn't always applied to immediately, because now we know what's going on with the fundamentals of science and how they can be applied to things that we don't understand. One thing that you don't hear a lot of, depending on where you go, when you study this book in scholarly circles, is the direct association it has with alcoholism and addiction. And so over and over again, if you ever go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting or something, at some point in time you're going to hear someone's story where they were, at some point in time, they were normal people, whatever normal could be characterized, as opposed to, I guess you would call it functional, as opposed to being non-functional. And that's what the story of Jekyll and Hyde does to the letter. It's especially notable that towards the end there's a suicide that occurs. Jekyll kills himself because Hyde is eventually taking over, and that's the spiral of addiction and alcoholism. It's just to the letter. It's not even, it's unreal how to the letter it is to that particular story, and it's tragic, and it really kind of draws to mind in some ways that we look at this story, and we've seen so many cartoons and movies about it, and we think of it as this fantastical fiction that's interesting to watch. Russell Crowe plays him in one of the latest movies that are out there. That's interesting to watch or neat to watch, but we don't really understand what that represents in the alcoholism addiction community. It's tragic and it's dreadful. It's just really kind of interesting that this book exists, because it can be mentioned in any one of those stories of someone going from a place of being wholesome to a place of being utterly corrupted. So that's just some sundry observations I have about Stevenson's wonderful book. His other favorite of mine that he's wrote is Treasure Island, but he has a bunch of writing that's outstanding. He's one of the great writers. If he wrote this in 3 to 4 days, as they say, I've never seen or heard of anyone who could write like that and have so few mistakes and not have to do the work it takes to produce a story like in the modern age where everything's edited down to almost nothing. The story of Jekyll Hyde, as most scholarly circles will mention almost automatically, is the duality principle in which we all have, as a single human being, we have split natures, that there's good versus evil, and these are wound into one. And what we see is when we give more attention and credence and power to either sides of these, whether it be good or evil, I guess we haven't really fleshed out what it would mean to just be ultra excessively good. And this, it's always drawn towards, evil takes over, and then so the balance just goes like this. And, if it's a fictional book, well, it happens in real life too, obviously, as I just described in the alcoholism addiction realm. But what the goal then really, as a message that the book is trying to send, is that there's a balance that needs to be maintained. We all have these evil natures and we all have these good natures, and what we have to do is we work perpetually to maintain that balance. And that's what's interesting about the yin and yang symbol. You look at yin and yang, and that's automatically what it means. We have the white side with the little black dot in it, and then we have the black side with the white dot in it, and that just shows, supreme equalization with, interwoven, the good has a little bad in it and the bad has a little good in it. And as long as that balance is maintained, then the logic would dictate that, life can be lived. But as shown here, if you give, too much power over to one or the other, then life can't be lived. Jekyll ends up dead. So anyway, that is my take on the Jekyll Hyde story. I hope you've been able to get some ideas for your essays, or if you're just prowling YouTube and the internet and you're looking for other videos to expound on the Jekyll Hyde story. I'm glad you made it this far, and I hope that you'll be back for the next video.